In the quiet residential neighborhood of Montgolfier, a 16-year-old black man, Malik, walked slowly down the sidewalk, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his hoodie. It was an ordinary spring day, with trees in bloom and a clear blue sky that seemed to go on forever. The cool breeze gently caressed her face, bringing with it the scent of blooming lilacs and the distant sound of children playing in their gardens. Malik had decided to walk home after school, preferring the tranquility of this walk to the hustle and bustle of the bus. He wasn't in a hurry, he had no reason to be. The world around him seemed peaceful, almost unreal, in its daily routine. However, that day, he did not know that this afternoon would mark a decisive turning point in his life. Malik was just a teenager like any other, with his dreams, his passions, and his doubts. Passionate about music, he spent hours listening to songs on his headphones, or playing melodies on his guitar that he had inherited from his father. He also loved playing basketball with his friends after school, forgetting the worries of the world for a few hours. And there were also video games, which were another universe where he could get lost to escape reality. He was a simple young man, but he lived in a world that was not always so simple for him. The gaze of others, the weight of expectations, the judgments he faced every day in this city full of contrasts. All of this weighed on him more often than he let it appear. As he walked down the quiet sidewalk, his thoughts drifted. He thought about his day, the classroom, the laughter of his high school classmates, the homework he dreaded doing once he got home. But today he was more thoughtful, more preoccupied. His parents had yet another discussion about his grades, and while he didn't want to disappoint them, he knew deep down that he didn't always have the energy to excel. Walking slowly, Malik let himself indulge in the mildness of the afternoon, without suspecting that the apparent tranquility would soon be shattered by a series of events that he could never have anticipated. Mrs. Dufresne's house was at an intersection just off the main street, an old stone mansion, carefully maintained and decorated with impeccably arranged flowers. Mrs. Dufresne was one of the oldest and most respected residents of the neighborhood. She was in her 50s and had a life that seemed perfectly ordered. She was a figure of stability in this neighborhood, well known for her impeccable management of her home and her active participation in local associations. Every morning she greeted her neighbors with a polite but distant smile, and was never without a word of comfort or an observation about the cleanliness of the neighborhood. But that day, like so many others, she settled into her favorite armchair by the living room window, her gaze scanning the street like an invisible sentinel. For several months, however, she had noticed this young boy who sometimes wandered around the neighborhood, alone, without any apparent purpose. Every time she saw him, she had a strange feeling, an almost imperceptible discomfort that seemed to grow with each passage. What is he doing here, alone, in this neighborhood? She often asked herself, as if his presence destabilized the carefully constructed order of her little life. Malik was not one of the children she usually saw in this quiet corner. He didn't seem to belong to this environment. His look, she thought, was a little too mysterious, a little too lost. These kinds of young people don't belong in this neighborhood, she thought more and more often, without even daring to say the thought out loud. It was a discreet thought, a silent judgment, but within it there was already a conviction. That day, while she was looking around her garden, she saw Malik in the distance, walking slowly as usual, his hands in the pockets of his sweatshirt. He wasn't in a hurry, he had no reason to be, and to her that seemed like a sign. She observed his face for a moment, his young and relaxed features, his gaze which seemed vague, as if he was not fully present. It was not the face of a well-bred young man, she thought. He didn't have the look of someone who follows the rules. An unpleasant feeling took hold of her. Ms. Dufresne got up from her chair, went to the telephone and dialed the police number. Her hand shook slightly as she pressed the keys. She explained in an almost hesitant but determined voice that a black teenager was hanging around the neighborhood, that he seemed suspicious, without any apparent purpose, alone, wandering around like an intruder. There must be something strange about him, something that didn't match the image she had of this peaceful neighborhood. The police, accustomed to calls of this kind, listened, but out of habit, they took the complaint with the sort of indifferent calm that one reserves for banal situations. While waiting for the agents, Malik continued on his way without suspecting what was coming. He had no idea he was already under surveillance. He had chosen this path to avoid arriving home too early and, ultimately, to enjoy this beautiful day a little more. He had the impression of floating in the spring air, far from the concerns of school or family life. But as he entered the main street, he saw the police flashing lights reflecting on the windows of the houses. He briefly wondered if this was another routine check. But seeing them stop next to him, he felt a pang of anxiety in his stomach. What were the police doing here? The police stopped abruptly. One of them, a man in his 50s with a hard look, named Lemoyne, got out of the car and walked towards Malik, his gaze scanning the teenager as if he were a latent threat. He stood straight, imposing. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a dry, almost accusatory tone, as if Malik had already done something wrong by being there. Lemoyne looked him up and down, observing his clothes, his attitude. Malik, taken aback but trying to remain calm, replied in a firm but respectful voice, "I'm going home, sir." He tried to maintain eye contact, to show that he wasn't there to cause trouble, just to get home. But Lemoyne did not seem convinced. He insisted.
"You're hanging out here, alone, for no apparent reason."
"You seem to have no goal. Do you have a name?" His tone was cold, distant, as if his whole manner of being said that Malik, by his existence, was suspect. The teenager didn't understand what was happening. He had done nothing that could justify this intrusion. But he also knew that, in this kind of situation, it was better not to react too sharply. He gave his first and last name, but that didn't seem to be enough. "Do you have something to hide from us?"
Lemoyne insisted.
This question, so banal but so full of implications, echoed in Malik's mind, like a warning of what he would have to face. The situation was becoming more and more tense. Malik felt an invisible, oppressive pressure tightening around him. He was used to this kind of situation, being accosted, judged in an instant for the way he looked, for the color of his skin. But today, he was in a neighborhood where he wasn't used to being noticed, and this gap between what he was and what was expected of him became glaring. A quiet, residential neighborhood, where young people like him, and especially those who look like him, have no place. With every step he took, the suspicion became more palpable. He felt trapped once again, in a world where he constantly had to prove that he wasn't who they wanted him to be. A simple teenager who returns home, like all the others. He tried to stay calm, not to give in to the panic that was rising within him. He knew that if he showed any nervousness, it would give more weight to the underlying accusations. He wasn't stupid. He knew they looked at him as a threat. Not as a young man chasing his dreams, but as a suspect. Life had taught him that in this world, being black was already a kind of condemnation, a judgment before he even had the chance to say a word. So when Officer Lemoyne mentioned his name, a strange and heavy feeling went through Malik. It was as if the wind had suddenly stopped. Time had frozen around him. He felt trapped between two worlds. On one side, there was his mother, Laura Diallo, the respected mayor of the city, a woman whose name symbolized the fight against injustice, against oppression. On the other, there was him, Malik Diallo, his son, a young black man in a neighborhood where his presence only fueled prejudice. And the echo of his name, spoken aloud by this policeman, resounded in the air like a sort of silent condemnation. He slowly turned his head towards Madame Dufresne, who had now joined the scene, her presence becoming more tangible, almost threatening. The expression on her face was a mix of confusion and reluctance, as if she suddenly realized she had made a mistake. There was no longer any doubt now. His simple status as the mayor's son was enough for the policeman to start questioning himself, for Mrs. Dufresne to question herself. But that wasn't enough for Malik. Nothing had ever been. When Madame Dufresne whispered these words, he's your son?" Shame crept into this woman's voice, as if the truth of a name changed everything. But for Malik, it wasn't the question of whether or not he was the mayor's son that mattered. What he felt was the instant stigma he faced, just because of the color of his skin. His heart sank, not with fear, but with anger, an anger he knew was misdirected, but which was boiling within him. Why did it always have to be him, this young black man, this simple teenager, the one who was arrested, the one who was stigmatized, the one who was accused. Lemoyne, realizing that the situation was taking a turn that he no longer controlled, straightened up, his tone becoming more polite, almost embarrassed. "We'll let him go, ma'am," he said. But Malik couldn't help but see a mixture of relief and guilt in his words. Malik turned on his heel, not even trying to exchange a glance with Madame Dufresne. He didn't want to see this woman. He didn't want this interaction to mark a moment in his life, a moment of additional shame, a moment where he had to prove that he was not what people thought of him. He knew that his dignity was not in this street, in this neighborhood. His dignity was in the way he carried himself, despite everything, despite the looks, despite the judgments. But this dignity was also the reason why he felt empty, exhausted. What was it for, if not to be trampled on every street corner, with every false glance, with every unjustified arrest? As he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the heavy spring air, he felt more alone than ever. A strange void settled inside him, a void that he couldn't fill with comforting thoughts. Society continued to observe him through a distorted prism, as if his very existence, his identity, placed him in a separate category, that of suspects, strangers, guilty people awaiting trial. And the pain of this injustice, although familiar, was still as sharp as ever. The next morning, Laura Diallo woke up with the weight of the day before still heavy on her shoulders. She couldn't shake the image of Malik, her son, arrested, humiliated, for a simple walk in their own town. She knew that this incident, although personal, was not just a family matter. It was a symptom of a deeper illness, an evil rooted in the very foundations of society. It was not an unfortunate accident, but a systematic manifestation of injustice. She got up early, her mind racing through her thoughts. How could she turn this personal pain into something bigger, more powerful, something that could potentially change things? How to react to the injustice of this act, when, for the first time, one's own son became a blatant example of the social brutality that so many young black people relentlessly endured. Laura was not a woman of impulsive reaction. She was known for her self-control, her authoritarian calm, her ability to face the worst adversities without ever flinching. But this time, she felt that the hour of anger had come. She could not let this incident pass without taking action, not only for her son, but for every young black man who, like Malik, was never seen for what he was, but for what society wanted him to be, a suspect, a potential criminal. She called a press conference for the next day. The city had to know. The city needed to hear what was happening behind the closed doors of wealthy neighborhoods, in the streets where, often, young black people were judged by their appearance and not their character. The next day, she arrived early at City Hall. The cameras were already in place, and the room was full of curious journalists. She walked slowly onto the stage, dressed in a simple but imposing suit, a symbol of her stature and authority. But behind the facade of this elite hid a broken woman, a mother devastated by injustice. When she spoke, her voice did not tremble. She was calm, but the weight of her words hit harder than any uncontrollable anger. "Yesterday my son was arrested for no reason. What should have been a simple walk through our neighborhood became an example of what many young people of color experience every day in our city, and everywhere else. Malik, like many others before him, was treated like a criminal simply because he is black. This is not an isolated case. It is a system that fails to recognize the humanity of young black people." She paused, her gaze darting across the room, settling into the eyes of reporters, city officials, spectators. We live in a society where the skin color of certain individuals makes them invisible, but at the same time makes them guilty without reason. She let the words sink in, then continued, "I am here today, not only to denounce the injustice done to my son, but to demand answers. This system must change. We must rethink the training of our police officers, review the way in which we educate our children in diversity and tolerance. We must ensure that young people like Malik do not grow up in fear of having to justify their existence every time they take to the streets." Laura didn't just describe the incident. It required a profound change, a transformation of society itself. She wasn't just talking about her son, she was talking about thousands of other young people, millions of people who, day after day, faced the same silent violence, this violence of marginalization. She was going to fight so that Malik was no longer seen as a threat, but as a young man with a future, as a full citizen of this city. Mrs. Dufresne, for her part, observed everything from the shadows. She was present, but invisible. She had not anticipated that her action, her hasty decision to call the police, would have such serious consequences. The weight of her guilt hit her hard. She wondered if she could ever look in the mirror the same way. She never wanted it to escalate like this, for a seemingly innocuous incident to take on such significant proportions. But she knew, deep down, that the echo of her actions resonated much louder than she had imagined. Malik, for his part, returned to his routine. But something in him had changed. Each step he took in the city seemed heavier, more marked by this experience. He had learned the hard way that society didn't see his innocence, but what it wanted to see, a threat. He knew that this experience would not be the last, that other incidents would come, but he vowed to never forget that day when he had been reduced to the color of his skin, when his own humanity had been ignored in favor of archaic prejudices. The city would never be the same again. What started as a simple misunderstanding turned into a catalyst for change. A conversation that could no longer be avoided, a movement that could no longer be ignored. And in the months to come, voices would rise, one by one, to demand a fairer, more equitable city, where each individual, whatever their color, would finally have the right to exist without fear.